Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this special webinar. My name is Tim Gray. I'm the Executive Director at Environmental Defence Canada, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's live talk, Big Oil's Big Reckoning. If you don't know us, Environmental Defence is a leading Canadian advocacy organization that works with government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling here from Toronto on the traditional, ancestral, and unsurrendered territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, all who are the rightful title holders and stewards of this land, and that we were invited into the Dish with One Spoon Treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, we are all calling in from different locations, and I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land we're on today. As we start this webinar, let's keep in mind that it is Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. Now today we have three very special speakers with us. We have Jewel Astrist from Keepers of the Athabasca, political economist and researcher Reagan Boychuk, and Dale Marshall, who's the National Climate Program Manager at Environmental Defence. If all of you could just say hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I want to explain a bit about how you can interact with us live on the webinar. If you're joining us live on YouTube, there's a chat box at the bottom or right of your screen. Feel free to say hello or discuss with each other and send us your questions there. We usually get a large volume of questions, so we won't be able to answer them all, but we'll try to get to as many as possible within our time at the end of the discussion. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the current state of affairs in Canada's oil patch. If you hear from industry boosters, and we do frequently, the first thing they point to are economic benefits. And it's true, Canada's oil and gas industry has generated significant wealth and jobs, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But discussions of these benefits are often exaggerated. For example, the oil sector's contribution pre-COVID to the overall Canadian gross domestic product is closer to 7%, not the 20% that's often talked about, or the much larger numbers that you might believe if you follow the politics in this country. The other thing we often hear, usually on social media, is that Canadian oil is somehow environmentally superior to other oil. This is untrue, as extensive, toxic, and expensive liabilities just keep adding up. Growing carbon emissions, thousands of abandoned wells, huge unpaid municipal taxes, and a shrinking workforce. As we'll hear today, regulators are even debating dumping toxic oil sands wastewater into the Athabasca River itself. These two claims, economic benefit and environmental performance, are not unrelated because we can't discuss any economic benefits by looking at one side of the ledger alone. And they do not bode well for a future of an industry increasingly under scrutiny for its environmental and climate performance. But most importantly, these liabilities have real impacts on real people on the ground. And today we're joined by some experts who will share their knowledge and experiences dealing with these spiraling liabilities. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Jewel Astrist, who is a project manager for Keepers of the Athabasca and has been doing that since 2015. She has been involved in initiating solar installation partnerships with local First Nations, recycling programs, a homeless shelter, cultural educational workshops, events such as Alberta Culture Days, and is a frequent speaker at conferences around Alberta. Jewel has been honored to work with groups over the past 20 years in Northern Alberta to address environmental, social, and waste management challenges. Jewel, over to you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to Environmental Defence for putting this workshop on. I'm coming to you live from Slave Lake, Alberta, on Treaty 8 territory, traditional home of the Dene, Cree, and Métis peoples. I just wanted to say before we start that as a non-Indigenous person, I'm stepping away from Keepers of the Athabasca now so that other people can step up and do the work. And in fact, Keepers of the Athabasca is joining up with Keepers of the Water because we need to have a joint group so that we're together and stronger together. So Keepers started in 2006, and Keepers of the Athabasca will likely end next year when we join with Keepers of the Water. We are First Nations, Métis, Inuit, environment groups, and watershed citizens working together for the protection of water, land, and air, and thus for all living things today and tomorrow in the Athabasca River watershed. So when we first started out, we did a lot of work with traditional knowledge holders that has really kept the group going, and I've been distinctly honored to be able to do some of those interviews. And just getting to my slides here. Before we get to the interviews, I wanted you to know about our declaration. This is a declaration that's in common with Keepers of the Athabasca and Keepers of the Water, and recognizing that clean water is a fundamental human right and it's essential. And we acknowledge that water is actually sacred. There's a lot of important research around this that is maybe not quite as recognized as it needs to be in the Western world, but we have to protect our water because water is life. In 2010, Keepers of the Athabasca initiated the Healing Walk, and in the proximal 5 years, this walk grew and grew, and we gained a lot of colleagues in other parts of the country who wanted to support it and became partners. We ended up bringing in, as a group of groups, people from around the world to walk around the tailing ponds, to witness them, to bear witness to them, to smell the incredible emissions that is called the smell of money in Fort McMurray, but actually causes cancer, and to just understand the experience that people of Indigenous ancestry and all the Indigenous communities around that area have to live with on a day-to-day basis. So these emissions, both aerial and into the water, are causing very, very extreme forms of cancer, rare forms of cancer, but all in all, a 30% higher cancer rate than the rest of Canada. And this has been brought to the fore by one of our board members, Dr. John O'Connor, down here on the bottom right. Dr. John was charged by the Public Health Agency of Canada with causing undue alarm back in, I think it was 2008 or 9. But even though that story went wide, very wide globally, the follow-up did not. And the follow-up is that he was reinstated. The Public Health Agency of Canada had to settle with Dr. John out of court because he is correct. The cancer rate is higher. And the most disturbing thing about this whole story is that the Alberta Cancer Board, after coming to this conclusion in 2008, was dissolved. They no longer exist. But the study that they put together with all of the local First Nations and communities has still not ever been completed. So it's a very, very disturbing story. One day, I'm sure it's one for the history books. On this slide, I also wanted to point out to you our traditional knowledge holder that we interviewed, Bob Snyder. He worked quite often with industry as a traditional knowledge holder, and he was very aghast at the way the scientists cherry-picked things that he would say and completely ignore other things. And he made that comment over and over again during the interviews, which I really encourage you to look at on our website, keepersoftheathabasca.ca, under the Tech Frontier. Whoops, I'll go back to that slide. This is our opposition to Tech's Frontier Bitumen Mine, which in all the decades of my work in environment and social justice issues, I've never seen a victory like this. Tech basically, after all of the joint review panel work to evaluate it, and after all of the people submitted comments, including us, they disavowed their own project. It didn't make sense financially, and it didn't make sense in terms of the climate change goals that we haven't seen, but still hope to see. So with our traditional knowledge holders interviews, we asked only 2 questions. What are the changes you've noticed in your lifetime? And also, what are your concerns for the future? And I really highly recommend you having a look at those. This is a project we did last year, Tailing Ponds and Impacts on Aquifers. This project was brought to us by Dr. Gilles Wendling right here. And he and his team of hydrogeologists with GW Solutions had been working with First Nations and other Indigenous communities for a number of years and had collected all this data about groundwater. And the fact is that tailing ponds are designed to leak. This image here is from an Environment Canada report, and it shows how they leak, and they've been leaking the whole time. And this was just finally, after 10 years, brought to light by Environmental Defense's campaign challenge, actually, with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. So that was under NAFTA. They did a big investigation, and they just released their factual record this month, I think it was. Dale can probably talk more about that, but I wanted to show you this diagram because it makes it so clear. The tailings leak down into the sand. Why? Because it's sand. It's not compacted clay. There's no plastic liners. It just leaks. It's as though they're using the sand and the geology of Alberta to filter their tailings before it goes into the Athabasca River. And it's not a very good filter. It's not an engineered or designed filter. It's like an accidental filter. So they do have these leachate return wells just beside the tailing ponds. And what happens is they catch the tailings that go out horizontally, but the ones that go down vertically are not trapped by the return wells. And obviously they're going into the groundwater, which has now been established. Keepers of the Athabasca and myself as their representative have attended many, many multi-stakeholder committees over the years. The first time we heard about tailings release, deliberately released to the environment, was in 2017 at the Tailings Management Framework Review. It was included as a bullet for the first time in treatment options. And of course, we immediately raised a fuss, but there it was. That was Alberta Environment that put that in there as an option. And we said, wait, that's never been there before. And they're like, well, it's there now, basically. No input was allowed on that. In the Tailings Mine Framework Mine Financial Security Program review, we learned that there's a tremendous liability that Reagan will probably talk more about that is not appropriately secured. There is no funding from industry to clean up their mess. The real wake-up call came last year in the Integrated Water Management Working Group. Actually, it was in November of 2018 that I was on the call at the time, and a very put upon employee of Environment Canada presented this document, which is Environment Canada's timeline for changing all of Canada's regulations that need to be changed in order to enable the release of tailings. So that's really, really disturbing. It sounds like they were highly pressured to do that, but be that as it may, they're doing it. This is the timeline. I don't know if it's held up by COVID, the way all of the environmental monitoring has been held up by COVID, but there it is, as presented in November of 2018. Currently, we're working with the Oil Sands Reclamation Interest Group that met just once so far in 2020. We've just been given a new series of potential dates to meet next month. Keepers is evaluating whether we will participate in this group. The terms of reference specify that the goal of the group is to authorize tailings treatment and release. So if that's what it is, we can't participate. We've asked for the terms of reference to be adjusted so that it reflects the fact that there's a lot of treatment options. We ourselves have proposed 2 different treatment options. Full containment, the tailings could be contained in tanks and evaporated from within the tanks using solar-powered fans. Also, tailings could be evaporated in a greenhouse type environment where the condensate from the evaporation will be much cleaner than what's in the pool in the middle. And then there's green chemistry. Green chemistry proposals in the 70s, 80s, and 90s were all rejected by industry. They were able to get the cost per cubic meter of tailings down to between $2 and $3. Some were $4 and $5, but the cheaper ones were $2 and $3 to treat a meter of tailings so that it wouldn't be toxic anymore. But industry turned all of that research down, publicly funded research, of course, millions of dollars. No, we can't do that. We need the price to be 50 cents a cubic meter before they would even consider it. So, they've had the upper hand this whole time. They're setting their own regulations. They're doing their own plans. The last bullet on this page is Syncrude's pilot project to treat their tailings by running it through their own pet coke waste, and then they want to be able to release it to the Athabasca River. And that's the end of my slideshow. So yeah, we are very, very concerned because of the health effects to people on the ground and also the environmental effects that people have been noticing. And the science seems to research all the way around these issues without ever noticing them. At a COSIA mine water management workshop yesterday, COSIA is the Clean Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. They're really deluding themselves with science. They had one young scientist presenting about baseline study compared to water management upstream of the bitumen mines. And she did not know, she was never informed that the location that she used for her baseline, Utikuma Lake, was the source of a huge spill in the 70s, as huge mining presence there at Utikuma Lake. It's not visible anymore, but when you're doing sediment cores, oh yeah, it's there. And if she's using that for a baseline, people are just sadly deluding themselves with a lot of the science that's going on. And then we hear lots of things like, I don't think there's a risk to fish or birds unless they hit the bitumen mat. Yeah, some of these quotes. People were starting to pay attention internationally, so we had to do something. Yeah, pretty incredible. A lot of chasing around science that will be beneficial to the industry and ignoring the science that is or answers questions we need to know. Natural processes continue to dominate the contamination. That's something they've claimed and claimed, yet the factual record produced by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation proves that that's not true, proves that yes, you can distinguish between natural processes and industrial. Not too much change in the past 150 years. This is Sediment Quality Mining Workshop. Just incredible, the delusion that's going on and the use of Western science to perpetrate it. And that's why we need traditional knowledge. People know things have changed. People feel it. Here's an example of where something really changed. The particulate matter that's coming down from the air, the emissions from the bitumen mines are visible on the snow, little particles, little black particles. And traditional knowledge holders have noticed this. And two of the knowledge holders we interviewed asked the question, is this going to make the forest more flammable? All this carbon falling on the forest. We've suffered these tremendous climate emergency disaster wildfires in Alberta. Are we making the forest more flammable through emissions? So those are questions that are guaranteed to never get answered by these bitumen groups and all of the various associated infrastructure that is researching purely to benefit industry. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Jill. Really appreciate that, and we'll come back with some more questions and conversation later on in the program today. Next, our next speaker. Just before we do that, just in case you are just joining us, that was Jill Asterix from Keepers of the Athabasca, who gave an overview of work happening to push back against liabilities in nearby communities. Next, we have with us Regan Boychuk. Regan is an independent political economist studying Alberta's oil patch. He has published a peer-reviewed study of royalties and profits with the University of Alberta's Parkland Institute and was appointed to the last Royalty Review Panel's Oil Sands Expert Group. A leading expert on Alberta's aging oil field infrastructure, he's participated in the provincial government's 2016 Liability Management Review, was retained by the University of Calgary's Public Interest Law Clinic in support of their intervention at the Supreme Court in the Redwater Energy case, and has briefed many provincial and federal offices. Regan, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. And so I want to focus a bit on my comments today on inactive wells, something that's in the news. The federal government in April gave the province of Alberta $1 billion of public money to help address this growing problem. And so besides just kind of communicating the scale of this particular aspect of cleanup in Alberta, I want to try to help explain how we got here, how things could be as bad. I think that's one of the biggest obstacles for people appreciating what's going on in Alberta. It's just even being able to understand how things could be so difficult, and hopefully I can help shed some light on that. And so inactive wells are one part of the problem, but it's a good indicator. These are wells that are no longer producing, but have not begun the process of being cleaned up. They're not permanently plugged to lower the risk of leaking methane or oil and natural gas, and the sites haven't been cleaned up. Spills and leaks haven't been remediated. So there's a lot of work left to be done, but they're basically at the end of their economic life. And so that's a good sign that these wells, as they pile up, it's a good indicator of the unfunded cleanup we have. And the red line is the growth of these over the years. And this issue of oil field cleanup was never really a concern up until the late 80s. Environmental regulations, environmental enforcement were virtually non-existent in Alberta until the late 80s. And that's also when we had a similar crash in the price of oil in 86, which led to bankruptcies, not unlike we see today. And so by 1990, this is when this issue was firmly on the public agenda. It was a major focus of public officials, and throughout the 90s grappled with trying to tackle it. There were a number of efforts within the regulator to get a grip on this problem. You can see the red lines are relatively flat throughout the 90s. There were efforts to rein it in, to put a leash on industry, to try to limit the amount of inactive wells that were being left behind. But that ended in 2000, and they've exploded since. And this goes up to 2017. It's closer to 100,000 wells officially today, but it's worse than that too. There's more inactive wells than that because of rule changes that hide a lot of inactive wells, and there's a similar amount. So there's at least 100,000 inactive wells in Alberta, and there's a very similar amount of wells that aren't technically classified as inactive, but produce so little. They're already depleted, and it's a very short step for them to join these other 100,000 wells. And so back in the late 80s, the regulator approached this from a common sense perspective. They publicly declared they were going to hold industry accountable for the cleanup. If a company went bankrupt and didn't have the money, they were going to go after previous owners. They were going to find the money from those that profited from it to fund the cleanup. They weren't quite sure because the regulator had never used these powers. There'd never been a lot of environmental enforcement. And so the regulators tested their powers in court. The Northern Badger oil and gas case was one of their test cases, where they tried to make a bankrupt company pay for cleanup. And in 1991, the appeals court in Alberta, in a unanimous decision, decided that yes, regulators have the power to hold industry accountable, even in bankruptcy, if current owners don't have enough resources to fund cleanup. You can go after the previous owners. But the reason this didn't have a big impact is because regulators had already cut a secret deal with industry. Before this case was decided, regulators had already promised industry privately that they would never use this power to look backwards. They would never go after previous owners for cleanup. So as long as you could sell your garbage wells to a sucker, the regulator was promising that they would never look backwards. And so while the courts affirmed 30 years ago that we have the power to hold industry accountable. We watch this problem continue to grow because regulators have refused to use the powers that they have to solve this problem. And the way that industry has been dodging this bullet for so many years is to transfer depleted and inactive wells to smaller and smaller companies, to get them off your balance sheet and give them to a sucker who's going to be stuck with the bag, who doesn't have the resources to do the cleanup. But the rest of the industry carries on, and these small companies are like garbage collectors. And so it's not a new problem. This is a joint industry government report from 1992 recognizing that there was a growing fears that this abandonment problem would become unmanageable in the future, but recognizing that more and more companies are getting rid of old and inactive wells and sloughing them off into relatively unsophisticated new companies with a limited understanding of their responsibilities as far as cleanup goes, and without adequate financial resources to do the cleanup when the time came. And so this is how industry reacted to accountability. They get rid of the mess and slough it off onto a smaller guy. And that's been going on for 30 years in Alberta. Regulators have been perfectly aware of it the entire time, but we've been unable to put much of a brake on those tendencies. And a big part of the explanation, a good part of understanding that, is industry capture in Alberta. A fantastic book by Kevin Taft, Oil's Deep State. A couple years old now, but one of the best books there is, understanding the power and influence of oil and gas in Alberta. And I'd suggest it actually goes a bit worse than that. It's not just that the regulators are too friendly. It's that industry is in a systemic crisis. This is other work that I've done. These are the profits in oil and gas outside of the oil sands. I'm not talking about the oil sands at the moment today, but outside of the oil sands, a lot of profit has been made, but those profits ended 10 years ago. And so this has created a systemic crisis, not just for industry, but for the regulators in charge of managing it. And so regulators are left with very few favorable options when industry doesn't have profits to pay for cleanup. And this dilemma of that regulators are trapped in the systemic crisis that gives them few options is a big part of the explanation why we see inactive wells grow so bad. And there's a lack of solutions. It's not complicated. It's never been terribly difficult about how to make the polluter pay to clean up their mess. But yet in 2020, we're transferring $1 billion in public money to industry to help deal with this problem before we ask industry to pick up. And so industry is reluctant. Regulators are reluctant. Politicians are reluctant to force companies into bankruptcy. And so there's a lot of inertia to the change we need to make the polluter pay. But cleaning up these old wells is an enormous opportunity for Alberta. It's an enormous opportunity for the energy sector. We have tens of thousands of unemployed riggers, and they can all do this cleanup work. And it's the only future we have. We don't drill many wells anymore these days, but there's tens of thousands of wells that would be cleaned up every year all across the province and be a welcome source of economic activity and jobs going forward. All that's missing is the political will to make the polluter pay. But the solution has all sorts of benefits for everyone but oil and gas executives. And so it's a political question. We have the legal power, we have the authority, we have the ability, understanding it's not a terribly complex problem. What's missing is the political will. And that's up to folks like us here in Alberta, but everyone else can help by recognizing the source of the problem and helping nudge Alberta into sensible directions. And one day we might hold the polluter accountable because if the polluter doesn't pay, taxpayers are going to have to. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Reagan. So we just heard from Reagan Boychuk, who gave us a brief overview of the legal situation regarding oil and gas liabilities in Alberta. Next up is our own Dale Marshall. Dale is the National Climate Program Manager here at Environmental Defense. He grew up in northeastern Quebec, and while undertaking a mechanical engineering degree at McGill, Dale discovered he was much more interested in the natural world and the systems needed to let it flourish than on working on built environments. This realization led him to pursue environmental science instead. And for 20 years, Dale has worked on environmental protection, mostly related to energy and climate change. Policy research and advocacy in Vancouver and Ottawa was followed by 2 years in Cambodia to assist people in communities most vulnerable and impacted by climate inaction. Dale, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Tim. I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to take you through basically the influence that big oil has had on delaying, killing, and weakening climate policies for decades now here in Canada. And I'm going to start with one example. This was back in 2013. The Alberta government had proposed a strengthening of the carbon pricing system there. The total cost at the end would have been about $1 a barrel. At the same time, the federal government under Prime Minister Harper had gone a different route and promised sector by sector regulations, and said that those regulations for oil and gas would be expected by summer of 2013. And essentially the oil lobby kicked in. They put a full court press on, memo to the feds explaining why they shouldn't be moving forward with those kinds of regulations, had lobby meetings, including federal, provincial industry talks, and essentially both initiatives were killed. And this is just one example of that we documented in a report that we published last year called The Single Biggest Barrier to Climate Action in Canada. That basically takes you through like every single climate policy that you've ever heard of and how the industry has tried to undermine it and to make sure it doesn't come to fruition. And as we often see, both in carbon pricing and other issues, what often happens is you hear individual companies kind of showing some support for certain initiatives like carbon pricing, while the lobby group, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, that all these oil companies belong to, plays the bulldog role of attacking hard, both behind closed doors and in public. And of course, they have incredible resources to undertake lobbying and to meet with government officials at the federal and provincial level. Just at the federal level, from 2011 to 2018, the oil and gas lobby had essentially 4 meetings per day, every single day of the year on average for 7 years. This was research that was uncovered by the Corporate Mapping Project. This is 5 times more than all the environmental groups combined on all the issues that we deal with. And of course, those lobbying efforts would intensify during key moments, such as in 2012, when the oil lobby convinced the federal government to weaken a number of environmental laws. Sometimes what the oil industry is lobbying for is completely clear. It's a public campaign. So the CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, in the lead up to the last Albertan federal election, put out their election wish list, which they called Vote Energy. And they were calling for a number of things, including the axing of environmental regulations. They wanted greater production of oil and gas. They wanted a whole bunch more infrastructure, more pipelines, more LNG terminals, and of course, lower taxes and lower subsidies. We did a modeling exercise to see if they got their wish, what would happen. And essentially Canada's carbon emissions would go up by more than 100 million tons, and we'd be that much further from the Paris Agreement. This would increase the oil and gas emissions by 50%, and would take up the majority of the carbon budget that we have before 2030 to meet our very weak commitments out of the Paris Agreement. I'll take you through a couple of other examples quickly. Methane regulations are intended to reduce this powerful greenhouse gas from oil and gas facilities. It's the only measure that's focused on the oil and gas industry, and access to information documents that were obtained from Saskatchewan that were being used in other provinces and federally from CAP showed that what they were looking for were fewer regulations, delayed regulation, so reductions pushed out into the future, and many more voluntary measures. This is one example of the more secret documents that we were only able to obtain because they got leaked or because we were able to obtain them through access to information federally or provincially. More recently, it came to light that there was a campaign by Big Oil obtained by Greenpeace. This campaign, the secret campaign, has been going on for 2 years now to convince Canadians that we don't need cleaner fuels. And part of that is convincing us that the battle against climate change is a losing battle. This is the kind of moral approach to climate change that the oil and gas industry takes here in Canada. And then another secret memo that we obtained, which was related to COVID, and it came from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers to the federal government saying, here are all the things that we need, given that we're facing a global pandemic. And some of the things were what you'd expect, the suspension of environmental laws and environmental monitoring. But some of them were incredibly egregious. Delaying the requirements for safer oil trains, for example, in the aftermath of Lac Mégantic tragedy, to be pushing off the need for more safety with respect to oil being transported by rail is reprehensible. The ignoring of Indigenous rights, even the suspension of the Lobbying Act, so that Canadians would know how much, in fact, the oil and gas industry was talking behind closed doors with our elected officials. Jewel talked quite a bit about tailings ponds. The Environmental Defense brought a case to the Commission for Environmental Cooperation that basically said there's lots of evidence that these tailings ponds are leaking, they're affecting fish, and therefore a violation of the Fisheries Act, and the federal government should do something about it. It took 2 different cases and 10 years, but finally we got a case was validated last month that basically cited all the evidence that we provided, that there were higher concentrations of these toxic chemicals from tailings ponds that were in the groundwater, that were in the tributaries of the Athabasca River, and that were in the Athabasca River itself. And that the feds had not adequately enforced the Fisheries Act. They had not laid any charges with respect to these leaks. And documents even from private companies such as Suncor and Syncrude showed that they knew the chemicals were leaching. Like they had documentation of these leaks. So overall, to me, the conclusion is Big O is not our friend. Like the industry's leaders like to tell us that, it's about jobs. We're a part of the community. They fund a number of community activities, but at the same time, they're attacking community health and safety. They're attacking Indigenous rights. They don't want greater environmental protection, and they're even willing to forsake the future of the planet. And for citizens and environmental groups, it means that we need to be a counterbalance. We need to engage government, our MPs. Citizens need to be talking to the MPs about the importance of dealing with climate change, the importance of dealing with the toxic impacts of the oil and gas industry. And for government, of course, we will continue to advocate for the things that will really provoke the kind of changes that we need. We need to transition away from oil and gas and other fossil fuels, and we need a plan to assist communities and workers to do that. We need to fully implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and ensure that that is taken into account anytime a decision is made in Indigenous territory when it comes to energy or industrial development. And we need to act as a country like we're in a climate emergency. The impacts are mounting. We are facing, greater wildfires, greater floods, all kinds of other impacts, tornadoes, and so we really do need to do much more in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, especially when it comes to the oil and gas industry, but also other sources of emissions. I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dale. So now we're going to have some questions for our panelists today. Many of them from you and the audience that are coming in right now, and some that we had earlier on in registration. Just to set the stage, get a sense of some of the scale of the liability that exists around oil and gas wells and oil sands cleanup. A question, I guess, for Jewel and Reagan. I've seen some information about the total financial liability for abandoned wells and also potential cleanup costs for all of the open pit tailings ponds for the oil sands. What are some of those numbers like? Can you give us a sense of scale of how much money we're talking about to clean up these things?
Sure.
Go, Reagan.
There's the regulator in Alberta has two estimates. They have a public one and a private one. They did an internal study reevaluating the public estimates. That's quite a bit different. And so publicly, the oil and gas industry is in the tens of billions, maybe around 30 billion, the regulator says publicly, while on the oil sands side, it's also around $25–30 billion. But when they did an internal study, they found the numbers for cleanup of the energy sector was quite a bit bigger. Instead of the 60 billion they were saying publicly, internally, the Alberta Energy Regulators' own subject matter experts determined that it was more like $260 billion, $250 billion. And they said repeatedly that was a minimum. And so that's the scale for which there's essentially a fraction of a percent is held in security. The industry hasn't put up the money. They don't have a savings account somewhere to deal with all this. This is only going to get paid for out of future profits. And so it's a big tab.
Thanks. Sort of a related question from Jim online here. He's saying that these pollution cleanup problems must be common to industry in other jurisdictions and other countries. Are there solutions that we can look to from these other places? How are they dealing with it in Texas or other places? Do you have a sense of that, Jewel? I see you're waving your hand there, so go ahead.
The COSIA, which is Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, that's the acronym name, and they're focusing on release, on tailings water release, and they had brought in experts from Germany and Australia and all over the place to talk about mine water and also specifically what they're calling pit lakes. They used to call them end pit lakes, but they took away the word end. So now it's just a pit lake. The guy from Germany established right away that pit lakes are very important in Germany. But all of the experts that were brought in were very clear that what their mines are a very different thing from bitumen. Very, very different. In Germany, it's mainly lignite. The water is clean. It doesn't have that high hydrocarbon contamination. So it's all of the experts were very clear that there's a huge difference between trying to apply that kind of technology to bitumen and using it in their own context. So yeah, I saw that comment and I'm trying to find it now here. Jim. Yeah, the pollution and the cleanup problems are common in industry and other jurisdictions, except our contamination is special. It's really special. It has naphthenic acids, which are hormonal disruptors and endocrine disruptors. They're very, very subtle. There was one study that they were talking about, and this was an Environment Canada one. Where's A2? Yeah, NSERC, which is the Natural Sciences and Engineering something. Oh, Research Council. So they were trying to adopt naphthenic acids and make them more water soluble. And one of the experts says, well, you know, you're making it more water soluble. Won't it then be more bioavailable to animals? And it's true. Like, I don't know, like I was saying earlier, I really feel that they're deluding themselves with cherry-picked science, and it's so harsh. It's so harsh. The people who live in the area are the ones that are suffering. I just want to bring up this slide one more time because I forgot to mention that Bob Snyder, the traditional knowledge holder that we interviewed, we were very, very lucky to get him on the day. This guy here, we were very, very lucky to get him when we did because very sadly, the fellow can't speak anymore. He's got throat cancer. So please read his interview. You'll understand how the science is being abused. And it reminds me of that song, Blinded by Science. Honestly, that it feels like that's what they're trying to do to themselves and to all of us and our future.
Thanks, Joel. Reagan, on the abandoned well side, is there other jurisdictions that have done a better job of requiring industry to set aside reclamation money, or is this like such a widespread problem that wherever we see the oil and gas companies being a major part of the economy, that they always make sure that they don't hold the liability?
Yeah, there is. I mean, you can point to tiny aspects. Most states in the U.S. require bonding, require some sort of upfront money, which Alberta doesn't. Of course, the bonding in the U.S. hasn't been updated since the 50s and 60s. It's grossly inadequate. And so, unfortunately, there is no good example to point towards. There's no one who has a firm grip on this all the way around. And there's trillions of dollars of unfunded infrastructure from the oil and gas industry around the world to get cleaned up, and there's no good model to look to of someone who's managing it properly. It's the extractive industry is the standard business model, is to make a mess, go bankrupt, and slide away. And regulators still haven't got a grip on that. Yeah,
we have examples of that in the hard rock mining. I mean, people may have heard of the Giant Mine in the Northwest Territories, which was abandoned and is now leaking, and we're all paying for that. We'll be paying for that for many, many years. A couple of people here have asked, what happened to the money that was given by the federal government recently, the $1 billion for abandoned well cleanup? Where's that at? Has that been spent? How's it being spent? How's that being prioritized? Any sense of where that money's gone or how it's being spent?
Yeah, well, it's not clear whether a formal agreement has been signed between the federal government and Alberta still. It was announced in April. The money hasn't been transferred from the federal government yet. They're still haggling over the details, but the provincial government has started dishing out that money, that $1 billion in $100 million batches, and so far they've gone through 4 rounds of committing them. And it's unfortunate the way it's being managed. It's not. We're not trying to stimulate more cleanup. We're not trying to create more jobs. The main effect of the way Alberta is choosing to dole out this public money from the federal government has been to replace private money that was already being spent on cleanup with public money. And it's created a lot of uncertainty in Alberta when there's hundreds of millions of dollars in public money being offered to do this cleanup work. Nobody's spending their private dollars to do that anymore. So the couple $100 million a year of regular work has ground to a halt. It's unclear whether anything more is getting cleaned up today, whether a single extra job has been created by that public money, because there haven't been any strings attached. There isn't the oversight committees in place, and it's being left up to the Alberta government, who's managing it just as well as they have with the rest of this problem.
So you end up having a public subsidy of cleanup, and it's replacing even the nominal amounts of money that were being spent on by the industry itself on cleanup. Julia, have something?
Yeah, if I could just add that it's really an intractable problem. And if you read Oil's Deep State, that book that Reagan is promoted, you'll find out why. If the federal government had even given that funding to the Orphan Well Association instead, it still would have gone to cleaning up these private liabilities because of the history and the intractable situation that, they've always just done the very, very least possible. And, now that the money is flowing, now they're doing nothing.
A couple of questions here related to who is behind oil companies in terms of financing, pension funds, banks, and maybe a question for you, Dale. What is the path to having the financial industry take greater responsibility for this? I think Reagan was talking a little bit about this earlier too, about earlier moves by banks to put some pressure on industry. What's it going to take to get Royal Bank of Canada or Canada Pension Fund and these other big backers of resource extraction to enforce accountability?
Yeah, I mean, it starts for sure with disclosure. We need to have laws in place that show the exposure that different companies have to climate issues. How much of their investments are going towards companies that are emitting, and why that's a risk for investors, given that we're dealing with a world where we have to severely limit our greenhouse gas emissions, quickly cut them, to have large pensions and other institutional investors not disclosing how much they have put towards companies that are causing those emissions is problematic, both from an environmental perspective, but also from an investor perspective. And that kind of disclosure is for sure the first step. I think we'll see more and more also, in addition, we'll see more and more of the kinds of shareholder resolutions that are going to put pressure on companies to be divesting more, to be moving their operations and their investments away from high emitting companies, high emitting activities. So, I mean, I think there's transparency is needed, but we also need a lot of investors to be thinking more concretely about these issues, like obviously from an environmental perspective and the future of the planet, but clearly from a financial risk perspective as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Obviously the money talks, and right now there's no requirement to actually spend. On the wells, is there any future other than capping them and cleaning them up where this infrastructure could have some other use? I've saw one of the questioners ask, could these become solar farms? I've heard people talk about them as a geothermal resource because they're so deep, they're down into warm rocks. What do you think about that, Reagan? Is there any future use for these, or are we just in a situation where we have to try and get them capped and just spend the money to do that now that they've all been left behind?
Yeah, I'm a little conflicted on these issues. Obviously, if geothermal works at these sites, it should be pursued. If solar works, we've done some work mapping all the inactive wells in Alberta and correlating that with the solar potential. And same thing with the geothermal. The reality is there's very limited potential for those sort of things. These they have some advantages. They have roads. They're connected to the power grid. But the number of these sites that are available for those alternatives is very limited. And Alberta just introduced Bill 36 this week to promote geothermal. And my worry is this is going to be a way to pass these liabilities on, pass this hot potato one last time. Now, with wearing a green cape looking like a hero, you take a contaminated site that's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to clean up, and you put a greenhouse on top of it, and you can disappear, and it isn't going to have to get cleaned up for another couple of decades. And so I think that's one of the bigger risks is this potential is going to be misrepresented, and it's going to be one more way for industry to dodge its responsibility. But naturally, anywhere it makes sense, it should be pursued, but we shouldn't be under any illusions that it's going to solve all of our problems easy peasy.
Right. A couple of people are asking, what is the pathway? What is Canada's national? Somebody's asking, what is Canada's national energy plan for transitioning away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy? What are the timelines, and how is this going to be accomplished? Dale, maybe you want to address that. I mean, I think the answer is simply there isn't one, but I'll let you elaborate.
Yeah, unfortunately, there isn't one. It's true. We have the Pan-Canadian Framework, which is a climate plan that will get us some emission reductions between now and 2030. It's insufficient to even meet our weak Paris commitments, and by that year, what we really need is first and foremost a decision that we are going to be phasing out fossil fuels. That's what's needed to deal with climate change. And if we undertake this gradually over the course of 2 decades and get to zero emissions, zero fossil fuels by 2040, it is entirely manageable undertaking. What it takes, though, is the kinds of policies that will reduce emissions quite significantly. On the one hand, it requires the gradual decrease in supply of these fossil fuels, but then also moving towards demand measures as well. Electric vehicles instead of vehicles with internal combustion engines, having homes that are not heated by natural gas, but create their own renewable energy, and therefore are net zero. In other words, they create as much energy as they use. I mean, the technologies are there. We know the policies work. That's happening in other parts of the world, piecemeal, gradually. Canada can adopt a lot of these, package them together, and have like a true transition plan that moves us away from fossil fuels and takes care of the people who are dependent on the industry now. We really have to make sure that we don't forget the workers and communities that are in there, that are in the industry now, and at the same time, like really start upholding Indigenous rights in Canada, like fully implementing UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to ensure that they have a say in industrial development, energy development on their lands. We're seeing all kinds of amazing projects that are happening, renewable energy projects that are happening in First Nations territories, and that's the kind of thing that we will see much more of once First Nations are not battling industrial development that they don't want on their traditional territories.
Thanks, Dale. And just for Jewel and Reagan, thanks so much for what you were talking about on the ground today in Alberta. I think it really shows the deep crossover between the power of the oil industry and government decision makers. And obviously, this is a huge challenge. What gives you some hope that all of us will be able to make these decisions, be more responsible in Alberta and Canada?
Well, I first of all want to say that hope comes from having the knowledge, and even when the knowledge is depressing, it's important to have that knowledge, but then to focus on the positive. So do focus on all of the Indigenous philosophies that call specifically for renewable energy, for preservation of resources, and the communities that are doing that. First Nations in Alberta are incredibly lobbied right now to try and get them into oil and gas with so many incentives. It's not even funny, but a lot of them have, successfully resisted to certain degrees, and they're doing their own thing, and a lot of renewables are involved. So always bring forward those positive examples, because if we don't do that, we're going to lose a lot of people. Basically, we have to have the positive.
Thanks, Jill. And Reagan, last word to you.
Well, and what gives me hope is the opportunity that lies in this problem to clean up. Offers a bright future. It is what a just transition looks like in Alberta. We put people back to work in the industry they grew up in, reversing the damage they did. And politically, things are bleak in Alberta. But my biggest source of hope is energy law in Alberta. There are legal avenues that we can tackle these problems, whether politicians like them or not. And there's an increasing awareness and engagement amongst Albertans around these important issues. We can't escape these. We don't get to retire elsewhere like oil executives And so there's a lot of interest that we're hoping to channel into productive avenues. And I think there is potential to make progress on these important issues.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining us today and for all of your thoughtful questions that you sent in. One way you can take action immediately on these issues is that Shell Oil, one of the big international majors, claims to be a progressive oil company that supports the goals of the Paris Agreement. We're currently calling them to live up to their climate rhetoric by leaving the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, which is so regressive. So we're focusing on that right now. You can send a letter to about that at environmentaldefense.ca/Shell. And I also want to take a moment to thank all of you for being environmental defense supporters and for tuning in today. It's encouraging to see so many of you taking action to protect the environment and working with us. A special thanks to all of our speakers today, Jewel, Reagan, and Dale, for their expertise and insights. And please keep in touch with Environmental Defense. You can follow us at Twitter or Facebook or reach out to us on email. Thanks very much and have a great day. Bye-bye.